Hi, we continue in Genesis 26 today with Isaac camped in the valley of Gerar and settling there, not far from the Philistines, and they notice that he's there, as we'll see momentarily. So as we continue in this chapter, we've been following the big chiasm that you can see on the right side of the screen that extends all the way from 25:19 to 35:22, and we've been in these green B interlude sections, and as I've been noting, and we'll see when we get to chapter 34, there are a number of verbal details as well as thematic details that connect these two, including the question of the vulnerability of a woman in the family called a sister to sexual abuse by one of the leading people of the local land, and some other things that we'll see when we get there, as well as some key words. As we've been noting, this is out of chronological order as we've been looking at here, so we can see that the sequence of events in these three chapters are apparently narrated in reverse order. So what we see in chapter 26 is before these things, before Jacob and Esau were born, and Abraham's death is certainly after Jacob and Esau were born by the chronology we've been seeing. But in our verse today, in verse 18, we have the problem that the narrator tells us for the Philistines had stopped up these wells after the death of Abraham, presenting it as something before this. But how can that be? Because the timeline certainly does not match. That if Abraham is 175 years old, he's still alive. Even if this is after this scene here, he's still alive. So the fact that we were told back in 25:7 that they buried him at age 175 means he must still be alive now, unless we're to imagine this scene is much after this, when Isaac is another 15 years older and Jacob and Esau are teenagers, and apparently that would be the time of the birthright, theft, etc., sometime around that. But none of that makes sense into the chronology we have. So we have to fall back on, we can't understand this other than that somebody inserted this at one point later and didn't coordinate it with it, or the understanding of what we see in 25:7 is that although he doesn't die until Isaac is 75 years old, he might as well be dead, but we have no basis for the metaphorical understanding of that. So it's just simply one of those pieces of data that's left hanging that doesn't fit either sequence, whether we take it in literal the chronological order we have in the story as given, or we reverse it like this. Just a little piece of hanging data there, as we can see. So we've also been looking at the key words, and in this section here, we're looking in this section, as I noted last time, the sequence of called is throughout this, calling the name of wells as we see, as well as calling the name of Yahweh, but also the commonly close words Shem and Sham, Shem for name and Sham for place, other way around rather, Shem with an E, with a Shem for there and Sham for name. And so I colored those all as brown because they're basically the same word, much like we saw in the garden story with Adam and Adamah and Dam and those things. Only the vowels change it. In those, though, Adamah actually has a hey, a Hebrew hey at the end of it to make it a different visual word, but Shem and Sham look identical without the vowels. And we see the focus here on this naming and there, highlighting this land that Yahweh has told Isaac to be in as a foreigner. But he told him to camp there, and he's settled there, which will bring up the parallel we'll see at the end of chapter 33 and the beginning of chapter 34, when Jacob camps in front of Shechem and then settles there, and then rape and violence ensue. So readers who are reading in chronological order don't know that yet, although it's hard to imagine any readers who already aren't familiar with the whole story. But perhaps you're not, as you know, so that's why I'm filling this in for you with those key words. We've also been noting the individual chiasm that formed this entire section of 1 to 25. But as I noted last time, we went through verse 17, but there was another little ABA chiasm as opposed to the ABCBA kind, with something in the center. Scholars note that this chiastic structure of this, the concentric relationship between texts can work a number of ways, and we see three different forms of it here. The 5-part ABCBA, the 4-part ABBA, and down here the 7-part all the way through D. So we see this big chiasm, and we didn't have a chiasm in the first part, in the original theophany and the wife-sister story, and now we had it though in the farmer's story, notice identically with the stopping up of wells and the phrase had dug in the days of his father Abraham, the call to go away and the fact that he went away. And then in today's passage, which we're looking at from 18 to 25, we have its own little chiasm, framing around the digging of wells and Father Abraham, the issue of naming, as I was noting here, and then the well of spring water, and the Hebrew for well is beer, and then we have Beersheba for 7 wells, although as we'll see, it's named differently here. So there's that as well, and the quarrels in the middle. And then we'll see next time this chiasm that forms the rest of the chapter. So the authors are, the compilers either way, framing the set of stories, both connecting them by the larger chiasm here, and of course connecting the Jacob story by the big chiasm that covers 12 chapters, as well as separating them out with these little chiastic units here. So I'll put the keywords up as we look at this, but I want to note that what's at issue here in this digging of wells and the quarreling with the locals over wells presents an ecological challenge that's presented very nicely by Nelsie Nafulia Nadulu, and you can see her picture here, and this article from just this year, 2024, although I shouldn't say this year, it depends on when you're watching this. So it's published in 2024, author's copyright is 2023, and she examines it from her Indonesian perspective, and I won't get into all the geology of water in Indonesia, but her experience of that highlights a familiarity that she can apply to the text situation, which is to say that the Gerarites are concerned that Isaac is farming is interfering with their traditional shepherding of the water that they've managed to coordinate as the local people of the land, and that this is interfering with it. And she also notes that in this region, which we can see here roughly on the map here between Gerar and Beersheba in this valley, but you can also see it here, what it really looks like on Google Maps. And she notes that because this is a relatively dry place, unlike the parallel story in Genesis 13 where Lot looks out across the well-watered plain and it looks like the garden of God, here wells are what are necessary for any kind of agriculture or for nomadic animal husbandry, as Isaac also has, because we were told he had flocks as well. So for whatever living possibilities here, the wells are necessary to life. And this is Philistine territory traditionally, and we hear that these are the Philistines, which is anachronistic in this context, as we've seen, but as I've been noting, this brings up the parallel with David and the Philistines and Isaac and the Philistines. Both situations, the Philistine leaders tell from their perspective, the foreigner to leave, but for very different reasons. As we're seeing in our story, he's already told him to leave once because his wealth, his prosperity has become something the Philistines are jealous of, but here it's going to be as interfering with the water. And then we'll see in the next scene, after he moves, Abimelech follows him down to make a border covenant and assure that for the future. So two different means by which people can interfere with local people's security, through the threat of violence or through the ecological interference with their living situation. So let's begin to look at our story with the key words up, and we'll follow as we do. So Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of his father Abraham. And we wouldn't know if the text didn't tell us the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. And we won't get into the details of Abraham's migrations and what he would have been doing in this place and when he was there and when he had these wells, but plainly for the present of the text, they've been stopped up. And so Isaac gave them the names that his father had given. They were literally called them by these names. Why does it matter? Well, there's certainly a continuity here. By naming it, it identifies it. But as I want to suggest, the naming here and the sequence is very parallel to what we see in chapter 30 when Rachel and Leah are contentious over over children and the naming of children. So as we can see, if we go to Genesis 36 and following here, we can see that kind of sequence. So Rachel describes something and gives a name, and then there are other children with other names from each of the women, both the two sisters and their maidservants as well. So we see that sequence and this sequence here, and that should not surprise us. Because the wells, like the women's wombs, are fertility symbols, and female fertility symbols at that. So out in the public space of the farming area, the men are competing over control of the fertility of the wells, and in the private space of the tents or the homes, the women are competing over the fertilities of their own bodies. And certainly the authors mean those to be parallel here, because both are necessary to the kind of blessing that Yahweh has promised to provide. So after this naming, Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of spring water, which is covering over the beautiful and specific nature of what it literally says, Be'er Mayim Chayim here, a well of life water. And as Sarna notes below, a well of this type is especially valuable. When originally excavated, it would have been lined with stone. Since a memory of its existence has not been preserved, it is ownerless and ought to belong to the finder. That's Sarna's claim, but on what basis would it belong to a finder who's not local? And that's one of the questions here. He's in the valley of Gerar now, not in the town of Gerar, about which we know nothing, but certainly the herders of Gerar out in that open area that you could see from Google Maps even now has a mixture of agriculture and other elements. So they certainly would have seen that these wells outside the town would have been theirs. And so this well of life water, the herders of Gerar quarreled with, using the word rib for a formal contention. And that's exactly the same word we see in 13:7 back here. And so it's translated strife here, but it's the same word. And as my note has, comparing with 26:20, between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. And that's where Abram offers Lot magnanimously the choice that Lot could pick whichever land he wants, and Abram would take whatever's left. Here we have a little bit of a different situation. And of course, Isaac wasn't born yet when that happened. Would his father have told him if you end up in disputes with local people, what would happen? The other aspect that's different is in chapter 13, Abram appealed to Lot's herders as were family, because Lot, of course, was his nephew. But here, this is not family, although perhaps in a distant way it might be, because as we noted in the wife-sister story, there's still some possibility of echoing from chapter 20 and 21 that Abimelech was Isaac's biological father. But that has nothing to do with these herders here at this point. So the herders quarrel, and they say the water is ours. And the word there is collective, not just for the herders, but it belongs to the people of Gerar. It's something that this foreigner is not entitled to. So he called the wall Esek, or contention. Notice it's a little bit of a play on Isaac as well, but it's a play here specifically on contended, so they contended. It's interesting that Isaac is calling these wells names even after the locals have claimed that it's theirs. And so he's really trying to claim some control in the land. And notice continually, they are not responding with violence. Unlike the folks in Sodom, when Lot is there, who both disclaim that he has the right to judge them because he's a foreigner, but also that he has the right to protect the visitors because they suspect that as a foreigner, he's letting in people who are dangerous to the city. But that's not what's happening here. This is there's contention, but there's not violence. So he's willing to name this because they contended. So then they, which is ambiguous here, but it certainly suggests that it's Isaac herders, dug another well, and they quarreled over that one too, and they called it Sitnah. Westerman suggests it means accusation, and Wenham suggests it means hostility. But notice how close this is to the sequence that we just saw in chapter 30 of the women giving birth and having names here, back and forth. So two of them they quarrel over. Notice they quarrel over it, but it's not saying the Philistine herders filled it in. It's just saying there's contention over it, much like there was between Abram's and Lot's herders back in chapter 13. So we moved from there, and then we get a very interesting connection. We get this very close connection between 12:8 here and 26:22 here, and then 26:25 we'll see. And the word for he moved, which is not pronounceable without the vowels, as you can see here, is only in these two places in itinerary. It's a few other places, especially in the Joseph story, but only these two places in itinerary. And then what they do is almost identical, using the verb for pitching a tent, which is only in these two places in Genesis, building an altar, which is only one of another place we'll show building in just a minute, and called in the name of Yahweh. So whether Isaac knows these are the things his father did way back at the beginning, again, they happened before he was born, we don't know. But he will do those in verse 25, as we'll see in just a moment. So putting back our key words from now. So we moved from there and dug a third well, and did not quarrel over it. We don't know why. Maybe it's far enough away. Maybe the Gerar herders have enough water to take care of themselves. No reason is stated. But because there's no quarrel, they call it Rehoboth, which means broad places. And we saw Rehoboth in the Table of Nations back here in 10:11 as one of the functions of Nimrod. Rehoboth Ir would mean the city of Rehoboth, or the city of wide places, or as some would suggest, that perhaps the city of wide streets. We don't know much about that otherwise. It'll be associated with Esau's line, though, in the end of chapter 36. But here it's part of this etymology for Yahweh has made room for us here. Using word rib here, you can see that Rehoboth has the same consonants except for at the end there, meaning breadth. So has given us room, and we shall be fruitful in the land. But notice throughout this issue, the question that God presents in the second theophany about we'll make your seed numerous, is it about children or is it about agriculture? In this immediate context, it's not about children. In the immediate context, it's about a farmer struggling to get water for his crops. And so we have to recognize that, again, both those elements, the provision of food and the provision of children, are part of what needs to be secured for Yahweh's blessing of fertility and the prosperity that comes from that to be fulfilled. And so from there he went up to Beersheba here, and we'll get an etymology for it a little later in the chapter in verse 33 at the end. It was the place where Abraham went after the binding of Isaac, when Isaac went back to Beer Lahai Roi. And there's no mention that Isaac has been there other than that it was a birthplace of his. And it raises a question of why he goes there, other than, as we've seen, it's the next closest place and it has water. And so that very night, Balayla Hau, anticipating the experience of Jacob in chapter 28, Yahweh appeared to him. And notice in our chiastic framing, that is identical to what we saw at the beginning with the chiasm at the beginning. But in the chiasm at the beginning, there's no response for Isaac. We simply heard that he moved on to Gerar. Here, it gives Yahweh's, in a way, giving him another chance. It both frames the chiasm, but it's suggesting, maybe you weren't listening to me the first time, so I'll try again. I am the God of your father Abraham. And notice what's going on here. The narrator calls him Yahweh, but God speaks as Elohim, and Isaac will respond with Yahweh. So an interesting element there. He certainly must know that the God of his father Abraham was Yahweh. It's hard to imagine he wouldn't have heard that. So that very night he appeared and said, I am, and in the Septuagint it's ego eimi, the great I am that we hear in Exodus 3 at the burning bush, in the Septuagint and throughout texts like John's Gospel, where Jesus regularly says, I am, identifying himself with Yahweh. So, and the God of your father Abram, do not be afraid, which we saw in 15 and 21, and we'll see other times, the most common commandment in the Bible. For I am with you. This one does not have ego eimi in the Greek. And will bless you and make your seed numerous for my servant Abraham's sake. And it's an interesting double entendre there, both anticipating the children that we have no reason to know he'd be concerned about at this point. Certainly readers of chapter 25 know Rebekah's already had children, but if we're reading it chronologically, we don't know that yet, but of course we do. So making your seed numerous for the sake of my servant Abraham, which is to say it's not for anything that Yahweh determines as meritorious on Isaac's behalf, but for the sake of the continuity. And that's what we've been seeing throughout this chapter, that what's being shown is similarity and difference. It's something like Mark Twain's famous line, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, that Isaac is faced not with the identical situation of his father Abraham, but with very similar ones, and is required to make choices to be in relationship with Yahweh, choices about how to respond to local people, choices about what to do with your wife when there's a suspicion that there may be violence if you're not careful. So it's all done for his sake, and then he responds. This time he responds. So he built an altar there, and that brings up the sequence of buildings we've seen in Genesis. And his altar here recalls the altar of sacrifice that he was put on, but also the altars to Yahweh in chapter 12 and chapter 13. He called on the name of Yahweh there, and notice the three uses of Shem and Sham, their name and there. 3 times here. Built an altar, Shem called on the Sham of the Lord, and pitched his tent, Sham. And there Isaac's servants dug a well, which seems like an after-the-fact point here, because in 26 we have a whole different scene where Abimelech gets his advisors and they come chasing after Isaac. So since Rehoboth was the one where they had room, why are they building another one? It's not clear here, and this one doesn't have a name and there's no contention over it. Perhaps it's simply to make the chiasm work, as we saw that it does in this situation here. So That resolves this situation peacefully, and yet it's not fully done from Abimelech's standpoint. He will chase him down and decide they have to have a more permanent solution to the problem of this invader who's threatening their water supply, and we'll see that next time. See you for that then. Bye-bye.